Hi there, I'm Mark, and welcome to Book Ramble, and this is about Andy Warhol. This is the second episode I've done on this book. I did a little comedic one to begin with, really based on when I was reading the book, certain things popped out like it was quite amusing. And overall, the book is amusing. There's some quite wry takes on life and some comedic little moments. On the back, they say it's an autobiography, published in 1975. To some extent, I can imagine Andy Warhol would have written this, but the writing differs quite often. And the debate has been how much of this book did he actually write. And the book, for myself, was really interesting because short little segments on various themes. So he'll look at, say, chapter 4, beauty. And then just another random one, 9, economics. The final 2 chapters are very wordy, and in fact, it's just listing. It goes on and on and on, page after page after page, of a character who he calls B. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Just saying how this, I'm assuming it's a lady, cleans various parts of her apartment. You read it and you think, where is this going and why is it here? Is it a filler? I don't know. I have a degree in art and design. I've always loved art. And when I was doing my degree, I studied mainly Bridget Riley, who was working in the 60s, David Hockney, so on. Not so much Andy Warhol, but I am aware of his famous artwork. Roy Lichtenstein is probably my favourite one, contemporary to him. But my main interest in art is Fauvism, Gwen John, and going back. So I was interested when I saw this because it was Andy Warhol, and what really got me was this philosophy. I was slightly mistaken. It is not philosophy. It's the philosophy of life, pointing out wry statements and the comedic side of life, the odd side of life. But it's not something that goes very deep, but overall it can be amusing. And it starts off that it's obviously about Andy Warhol, his perspective, but he often talks about a character called B, who it wrong foots you when you're reading it to find out it's more than one bee. It could be male or female. One of the bees happens to be his hairdresser, and that's another thing that comes across quite strongly towards the end. He goes to Italy. He's going for some kind of a photo opportunity. He's hanging around the likes of Liz Taylor, Ursula Andress. And he's quite open about the fact that all of them, literally their entourage, includes hairdressers. And that Andy Warhol reckons that these famous people, these stars of the screen, are incapable of going around anywhere on their own. They must need assistance, an entourage with them. And specifically the hairdresser to make sure they look good if there's any opportunity for a quick interview or photographs. Overall, what he does, he looks at his life, pokes fun at it, and he brings up some quite interesting comments about how it's lonely, how he, despite being world famous, is obsessed with other stars and wanting to get to know them, to be seen with them. So in a way, it's private, it's honest, but how much of it is true? And he talks about here, very quickly on page 15, Campbell's soup cans and Elizabeth Taylor and Marilyn Monroe, that's America. Interesting that Elizabeth Taylor wasn't American. She was naturalised, but she was British. So what we get is snippets and scenes of people that I've written down here as being broken. And also, and I don't know the answer to this, at points in the writing, it would appear that Andy Warhol was autistic. I'm going to look that up. He was never officially diagnosed with autism, but many medical professionals believe he exhibited traits consistent with the condition, particularly Asperger's syndrome, according to a 1999 article in the newspaper The Guardian. What they say is what I would say is in the book. Social awkwardness, a fascination with consumer goods, and a tendency to use repetition in his artwork. Some fans have been hesitant to accept this theory, feeling it diminishes Warhol's achievements. Not sure why that would be. He is obsessive in this book, collecting things. The way in which he constantly lists things, especially towards the back. The back of the book, the final 2 chapters, is bizarre. It's a long diatribe of B, who's a woman, talking about cleaning, and it goes on and on and on. It's just listing of products being used. Although, as part of that text, in the final chapter, he talks about socks. Socks just disappear, he says. Dry cleaners, and they still come back with one missing. It really is a law, the diminishing return of socks. It's true. We all know this. What happens to these socks? It's unbelievable. So it can be quite amusing. It will break your face from the rictus into a smile. But it's interesting as a psychological profile of this man. There are multiple Bs. He doesn't name the people who he's talking to. At first, I thought it was just a woman. And in my mind, I just made up a name, Belinda. Then you realise when he's in Italy, halfway through the book, he's there with a B who's male. It's his hairdresser. And Warhol is obsessed with the people around him. Elizabeth Taylor, who he did a film with, and Ursula Andress, and they're all got their own entourage, like I said, for these people to do their hair. It's unbelievable. Rye looks at life, though they are dated. He talks a lot of things about daily life in New York, using equipment that is no longer there. So it's amazing how quickly it dated. And I would say, although this came out in 1975, I would imagine this was dated by the late 80s. There's a lot of aphorisms. Some chapters and themes are, I think, too personal to himself for ourselves to really resonate with it. Unless you're him or like him at that time, it may literally leave you cold. Talking of cold, he actually does admit, if it's him writing in the book, that he is, there's the word, reptilian. He repulsed people, and he was aware of it. And he talks about his blemishes, his skin, his awkwardness in front of people. People would have met him and I think thought, well, okay, keep away from him. There's a lot of stream of consciousness and some dry humour. The first thing that I made a note of, and again, a lot of this is because it's subjective to myself. I will read things here that I will pick up on that another reader won't. So I'll just go through the things that resonated with myself. He says, at a certain point in my life, in the late 50s, that's the 1950s, not his age, I began to feel that I was picking up problems from the people I knew. One friend was hopelessly involved with a married woman. Another had confided that he was homosexual. A woman I adored was manifesting strong signs of schizophrenia. I had never felt that I had problems because I had never specifically defined any. But now I felt that these problems of friends were spreading themselves onto me like germs. So there's this theory that because we're energetic beings, energy attracts energy. Unless you're careful, you're going to attract a certain type of person. And I would say Andy Warhol, judging by this book, attracted broken people. They were either broken emotionally, physically, or in other ways. But I'm interested that he was soaking up people's troubles around him. A lot of people can do that. My daughter's very similar. She has to be very careful. She's very sensitive to people's energy. He mentions the word manifesting, which is unusual. You don't often get that. Manifesting, you can make something. So a woman I adored was manifesting strong signs of schizophrenia. Interesting. Not exhibiting, manifesting. And I wonder if it meant the same then as it does potentially now. He also writes, as soon as you stop wanting something, you get it. I found that to be absolutely axiomatic. And that is a spiritual truth, I reckon, that if you want something, if you're desperate for it, you push it away. Just relax, move on, ignore it, and then it tends to happen. Which he then links to himself later. He says, in the years after I've decided to be a loner, he decided to be a loner, interesting, I got more and more popular and found myself with more and more friends. I was born in 1964. I remember my mum saying that the 60s didn't really start until 1967. That was the period in Britain where Britpop, as it was called in the 90s, really kicked off. We'd had the Beatles for a while, and the Rolling Stones, and then obviously Carnaby Street, and it was just as it was going into the psychedelic era. Andy Warhol, however, reckons it's 1963. It seemed like everything was starting then, possibly for himself. He reckons it was the counterculture, the subculture, pop, superstars, drugs, lights, discotheques. Whatever happened to them? Whatever we think of as young and with it probably started then. And this may be a truism of all countries at that time. You had to be rich to be able to afford pop clothes from boutiques like Paraphernalia or from designers like Tiger Morse. Tiger would go down to Klein's and May's, I'm assuming that's a shop in New York, and buy a $2 dress, tear off the ribbon and flower, bring it up to her shop and sell it for $400. He's poking fun at the world in which he was part of. And he openly talks about it, but not in a derogatory way. But this world was false, and it was ripping people off. People would come and buy stuff from people because they saw it as a title. But it was cheap. How often does that happen? He gives quite a few insights into people that I'm not aware of. They would have been close to him. You may know these people. Taxi is one of them, who is definitely a broken person, as I said. She had a poignantly vacant, vulnerable quality that made her a reflection of everybody's private fantasies. She could somehow always make you believe her. That's how she got what she wanted. After one look at Taxi, I could see that she had more problems than anybody I'd ever met. So beautiful, but so sick. I was really intrigued. Warhol, throughout the whole of the book, is surrounded by these people. I think he almost admits that he's one of them. It's probably why he divides people even to this day. But like I said, there's some truisms that, well, what makes it true? Just because I say it's true doesn't mean it's true. But they're interesting and they strike a chord with me. Especially this one. It's on page 44. You can tell I found it interesting because I gave it a double star. I do that. It's the long lifespans that are throwing all the old values and their applications out of whack. When people used to learn about sex at 15 and die at 35, they obviously were going to have few problems than people today who learn about sex at 8 or so, I guess, and live to be 80. That's a long time to play around with the same concept, the same boring concept. Okay, let's take out the age there, especially the 8-year-old and what he's referring to. But let's suppose that what he's saying is that we have longer lifespans now. I mean, it used to be that you were lucky if you got beyond 40. And yes, you matured quicker because you had less life as an adult. But now we have longer lives, and what seems to be happening is that we're remaining much more immature longer. But you still have decade after decade after decade, after a certain period when your body is potentially no longer able to do certain things, that you're going to be alive. I think most people, if you was to pick up a magazine, and this is something that de Botton talked about 20 odd years ago, and he's a British commentator, philosopher. He talked about status envy, that if you pick up the Sunday magazine, he wouldn't recommend you would do so, because when you look at it, you're seeing adverts of people's lives that you don't lead. And it brings this thing called status envy. You're never going to have this house like they show you. Then you're never going to go on these holidays. So don't do it. But of course people do. And they soak themselves decade after decade in status envy. So by the time they get to 60, 70, no wonder they're upset. No wonder that age group now seems to be going out in a grumpy kind of manner, which is a shame. I think what he says here, it's true that our extended lifestyle and lifetimes does not help us. Well, specifically if you're focusing on only certain things, I guess. Lack, fear, doubt. Decade after decade and decade after decade of that is going to have an effect. Not linked to that, but I'm linking it. 2 pages later, he talks about this Andy Warhol, his own jealousy. He says, I get jealousy attacks all the time. I'm jealous at dinner that somebody else will think of something better to order than I did. I'm jealous of somebody's blurred Instamatics, even when I have my own sharp Polaroids of the same scene. Fear of missing out as well. It's an interesting read. You can pick stuff out of here that would resonate with our own lives, I guess, because we all kind of feel the things that he's writing about. That is what is good about this book. Like clothes. Now, this is a guy who would have been given clothes, he does get clothes, and gifts, but he criticises them. He says, but then labour got expensive, and the manufacturers began giving a little less good workmanship for the money every year, and nobody really complained, so they pushed, and they're still pushing to the limit how little they can give before people will say, is this a shirt? The moderate-priced clothes makers really are giving people junk these days, on top of the awful way the clothes are made. Long stitches, no linings, no darts, no finished seams. They're made out of synthetics that look awful from the first to the last wearing. The only good synthetic is nylon, I think. I personally, one of my hopes is that I could go into any shop in New Zealand and then go to Australia, into any shop, and then to the UK, and then to America, in any shop. And universally, a medium will be the same everywhere. But there never are. I could buy a medium t-shirt, and it's like, because it happened to have been made, say, somewhere where the medium frame of the average person is half of mine. I can go to specifically the UK and get a medium, and it's like ballooned out, it's like huge. So I think I agree with Andy Warhol. So this book is never going to win an award for the prose. Quite pedestrian, but utilitarian. Not to say it's not bad. And then it gives these personal little, I suppose, sound bites, we'd call them now. To me, he says, good talkers are beautiful because good talk is what I love. The writing is done in the way, potentially, that he would have talked. So there is that. I have a very keen interest in history, and specifically how real people would have lived at certain points. Not the big I ams, but the lowborns, the ones we never hear about. So this wry observation really gets me. He says, I think about all the people before eyeglasses were invented. It must have been weird, because everyone was seeing in different ways according to how bad their eyes were. Now, eyeglasses standardise everyone's vision to 20/20. That's an example of everyone becoming more alike. Everyone could be seeing at different levels if it weren't for glasses. Yeah, I'd considered that before. His lifestyle, I think, replicates a lot of people then and now. And it's a rarefied air in which they breathe. They're surrounded by people whose sole job is to make them look great and feel great. And they go, or they stagger, from one moment to another in which they're very conscious of the way they look. He talks in the chapter, which one number is it? 5, about fame. He says, some company recently was interested in buying my aura. I think aura is something that only somebody else can see, and they only see as much of it as they want to. It's all in the other person's eyes. You can only see an aura on people you don't know very well or don't know at all. I think aura now has a different meaning. Some famous people have something that if somebody could bottle it, they think they're going to make them very rich. It's like the old adage that some people, the camera loves them, and you're drawn to their face or their eyes or whatever. It's very fickle. It's very interesting. I wonder what it is that draws people to be in awe of certain famous people, because that does happen. And when somebody writes a really mean article, I always just let it go, because who are you to say that it isn't the truth? So he does admit that for him and others like him, it's all a performance. It's a continual performance, which is why they like their away time when it's just themselves. Good performers, he says, and I think he's talking about actors here, are all-inclusive recorders because they can mimic emotions as well as speech and looks and atmosphere. They're more inclusive than tape recordings or videotapes or novels. So what is it about famous people that we're attracted to? Now, I wasn't aware that in chapter 6 he talks about this at work, that he had been shot in the 60s and it had an effect on him. Probably this would have led to the writing of this. I'm interested, as always, as to why it was written when it was written, not later. Well, he says, before I was shot, I always thought that I was more half there than all there. I always suspected that I was watching TV instead of living life. That's dislocation. I've had that. I had a pretty bad upbringing. I don't remember much for my first 8 years. For specific reasons. And I got this vivid memory of walking down the high street of my local city where I grew up, Leicester. And it was though I was 15 feet above looking down on myself. I could even see how my mum was walking. And the streets, and there was this red Leicester bus going by. And it's like, I was there, but I wasn't there. Years later, I found out that's quite common. Trauma, it's dislocation. And that's what he's talking about here. And the movies make emotions look so strong and real, whereas when things really do happen to you, it's like watching television. You don't feel anything. So how accurate then is TV, films, novels when it comes to emotions? We probably see them over-embellished for effect, especially on the stage. But is that how we really feel emotions? Or do we just go quiet and within ourselves, shock? Again, I'm looking through what he's written here. I'm tempted to talk about all of them, but there's too many, really. I'm going to have to skip over stuff. But he talks about the fact that how he looked. He said, I thought that young people had more problems than old people. Not sure about that. And I hoped I could last until I was older, so I wouldn't have all those problems. Then I looked around and saw that everybody who looked young had young problems, and that everybody who looked old had old problems. The old problems to me looked easier to take than the young problems. So I decided to go grey so nobody would know how old I was, and I would look younger to them than how old they thought I was. I would gain a lot by going grey. Yeah, that's how I'm going to see it. This particular one about himself and the people around him, de Botton would agree with. He says, sometimes you fantasize that people who are really up there and rich and living it up have something you don't have. That their things must be better than your things because they have more money than you. But they drink the same Cokes and eat the same hot dogs and wear the same ILGW clothes and see the same TV shows and the same movies. Rich people can't see a sillier version of The Truth or Consequences or scarier version of The Exorcist. You can get just as revolted as they can. You can have the same nightmares. We're all superstars then. So I've got this book, The Dragon Book of Verse. It's old, well used, 1935. I'm actually using it because there's going to be there have already been episodes coming out in which, like for instance, lines said to have been written at the eve of his execution by Walter Raleigh. There it is. And there'll be others that I'm going to start recording soon. One, I think, is going to be Henry V at the Siege of Harfleur. Once more onto the breach, dear friends. Once more, Hamlet's soliloquy. To be or not to be? That is the question. Those kind of things. But they're old. And a lot of the books, Plato, philosophy that I read, they're all old. He says, I always think about the people who build buildings and then they're not around anymore. Or a movie with a crowd scene and everybody's dead. It's frightening. He was obviously obsessed with death. Well, no, that's not right. I won't say that. Himself, his life, he was obsessed with. And he's now gone. So these words are from the past, of which everyone he probably mentions is no longer with us. We move on. Time is fickle, I try to think of what time is, and all I can think is time was. If the lines on your hands are wrinkles, it must mean your hands worry a lot. Every time I hold my hand up to do this, I always notice this thing here. It's a mole. This looks like I've got paint on it somewhere. When you look back at old photographs, in fact, recently, the guy I do another channel with, we served together on HMS Charybdis in the 80s. And he flicked me some pictures back in 2020 when we first hooked up again after 30 odd years. And I knew it was me, but I couldn't recognize myself. It was like, is that me? Did I ever look like that? Especially when on a previous ship I was younger. I was about 19 out in Hong Kong. It's like I just did not recognize myself at all. So when you look at pictures of yourself as you're getting older, it's like this guy talks about, this slight dislocation. We know that we were there, but nearly everything in the background has passed away now, or the people in the streets. That's always fascinated me, and it seems it did Andy Warhol. Perhaps we're kindred spirits. Although I wouldn't like to be considered reptilian. Like I say, a lot of the book is dated. It will be. It's a right insight into living in New York, specifically in the 70s, possibly late 60s. Because memory, when you're writing, tends to be from 3 or 4 years back. So just to finish off, he mentions my favourite a lot. I made a note of this. He talks about my favourite, my favourite, my favourite. He does a lot of listing. Don't forget, he found and promoted other artists. He found Basquiat, who was a subway artist that he promoted. He said, the kids who spray graffiti all over the subway cars at night have learned how to recycle city space very well. They go back into the subway yards in the middle of the night when the cars are empty, and that's when they do their singing and their dancing on the subway. The subways are like palaces at night, with all that space just for you. And he's obsessed with smell. He talks about smells a lot, cologne. So it's a lot of inner feelings. Towards the end, the last 2 chapters are a bit of a grind. He's just listing all the time. I don't know, perhaps he had a certain amount of words to include and he just padded it out at the end. I'm glad I read the book, but it's not going to be on my list of things to reread in the future. I've got a handle of Andy Warhol or his observations he would like us to think were his, and for myself, that's enough. It's definitely worth a dip into if you come across it, just to see if whether anything he says resonates with you, because he is influential. There's no doubt about that. So I've made a career out of being the right thing in the wrong space and the wrong thing in the right space. That's one thing I really do know about. So he's slightly one step to the side of the mainstream of life. He's unconventional, which sets him apart and which I like. I wouldn't say he was innovative, but he was influential, definitely. And he's worth a study just for that. So The Philosophy of Andy Warhol. Interesting read, and I think I'll leave it at that. Reading this book makes me now think I've got to go off and do some cleaning, because that's all he talks about at the end. Yeah. Ta-ta for now.